Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to take a look at another horrible case with you. A horrifying tale of a woman's revenge. It's said that a humiliated and insulted woman is capable of anything, with the most terrifying in this list being revenge, cruel, ingenious, and sometimes unpredictable. Much in this regard depends on the lady's level of sanity, but one must not overlook the depth of her hurt. This destructive emotion can be carefully hidden within a woman for years, but if it erupts, it will sweep away everything in its path. The story of the Bobbitt spouses in the early 90s shook the world, and their surname became a byword, spawning the verb to bobbit, which means to cut or to chop. This case drew heightened public attention not just to the issues of domestic violence, but also to such a delicate subject as marital assault, which many try to sidestep. Let's delve into everything step by step. Who is Lorena Bobbitt? Lorena Leonore Bobbitt, born Gallo, was born on May 15, 1970, in the town of Bucay, located in eastern Guayas, Ecuador, near the province of Chimborazo. She was the youngest child in a simple and very modest family. When she was in elementary school, her family moved to Venezuela and settled in Caracas. Lorena grew up quite clever. She performed well in school, was diligent and goal-oriented. In her teenage years, she lost her father, and her relationship with her mother, Elvia Gallo, was quite strained. As soon as she graduated from school, she decided to move to the United States to live with her paternal cousin, Yana Basutti. Her relative gladly took her in and helped her with the paperwork for a student visa. However, she was a very conservative woman, so Lorena, living in her house, had to abide by a strict set of rules, just like Yana's own children, and also take on some of the household duties. Despite everything, the young woman decided to stay in the U.S. as she realized that it offered her far more opportunities than Latin America. She had long been attracted to the beauty industry, so Gallo decided to train as a manicurist. Moreover, Basutti owned her own beauty salon located in the city center, had extensive experience in the field, and was eager to help her niece learn the profession by allowing her to observe the work of the specialists and practice on her own. Later, her aunt arranged for her to work part-time in her salon. Meeting John Bobbitt. About 8 months after she moved to the new country, the young woman had settled in, enrolled in college, and was working as a manicurist in her relative's salon while gradually saving money. In September 1988, Lorena was preparing to go to a party with several of her friends. Her aunt gave her strict instructions on how to behave and what time she needed to be home, and she promised that everything would be fine. The modest young beauty was nervous, as it was her first time preparing to go to a nightlife establishment so late at night. She chose a relatively modest outfit, unlike her friends, applied makeup, and styled her hair fashionably. Upon arriving at the nightclub, she was struck by the carefree and festive atmosphere inside. The venue was filled with young people dancing, having fun and socializing, and Lorena couldn't help but think that such a place might be where she could meet the man of her dreams. This thought proved to be prophetic. A few minutes later, she noticed a very attractive young man intently looking at her and smiling. He waved at her, and she waved back. Then the young man approached her and introduced himself. He was John Bobbitt, and he could not take his eyes off the young beauty with the quite exotic appearance. The guy was handsome, tall, and charismatic. He cracked jokes and skillfully paid compliments, so she couldn't resist his charm. They spent the evening dancing and chatting, and afterwards, the new acquaintance walked Lorena to her aunt's home. As they said goodbye, he asked for her home phone number and promised to call soon. Who is John Bobbitt? John Wayne Bobbitt was born on March 24, 1967, in Buffalo, in the northwestern part of New York State. He was the youngest of 3 children in his family. At the age of 3, the boy lost his father, who tragically died, and his mother, unable to cope with the shock, ended up in a psychiatric clinic after a serious nervous breakdown. All 3 children were taken into the care of their religious aunt and uncle, who wanted to help their relatives in this difficult situation. The boy was still very young at the time, but the events that occurred undoubtedly left a mark on his life. The aunt and uncle raised the children with strictness, in accordance with religious canons. They all attended church every Sunday and engaged in charity work, trying to help those around them. John was not an outstanding student, but overall, he did fairly well in school. As a teenager, he decided to pursue a future in military service. After undergoing the necessary training and special preparation at a military academy, the young man joined the ranks of the Marines, where he proved himself as a brave, disciplined, and determined young man. However, after a few years, the strict regime and the need to obey in the army began to weigh on him. After leaving the service, with some military experience and skills, he was hired as a security guard at one of the city's popular establishments. But he later changed jobs frequently, not staying long at any. A whirlwind romance and a modest wedding. The day after they met, John, as promised, called Lorena to ask her out on a date. The young couple simply walked through the park, engaging in easy conversation about various topics, and John made it clear that he wanted to continue their relationship. Lorena was not opposed to this, but according to the rules set by her aunt, she had to introduce her boyfriend to her before they could start a serious relationship. John accepted all the conditions, and on the appointed day, he came to dinner at the home of his beloved's relative. Bobbitt was very sweet, courteous, and considerate, yet he made an effort to appear serious. He managed to make a good impression on the strict Yana, and after a serious one-on-one conversation with the young man, the woman allowed her niece to continue seeing John. 6 months after the start of their romantic relationship, the suitor proposed to Lorena, and she accepted. She was overjoyed, having always dreamed of a family, children, and a home of her own. The couple began preparing for the most important event of their lives, and in June 1989, shortly after Gallo turned 19, they made their union official. The wedding celebration was quite modest, as the young couple did not have the money for a lavish ceremony, and they chose to spend their savings on a honeymoon by the warm ocean coast. They were happy, but the only shadow over the celebration was the absence of the bride and groom's parents. Instead, their aunts and uncles came to share the joyous moment with them. And so the fairy tale ends. After the wedding and a delightful honeymoon, the couple moved to Virginia and settled in a quiet and cozy area of the city called Manassas. The first few months of their life together were like a real fairy tale. They enjoyed each other's company, showing mutual tenderness, care, and love. But as the new year of 1990 approached, the situation began to change for the worse. At first, Lorena tried not to pay much attention to some of her young husband's sharp remarks and rudeness, thinking it was just a so-called adjustment period. But one day, when she served cooled soup for dinner, her husband simply threw the plate on the floor and then started yelling at his wife, insulting her and calling her a terrible homemaker. She tried to argue, pointing out that John was to blame since she had called him to the table several times, but he was too engrossed in the TV. In response, he slapped her, and she retaliated in kind. Lorena had always believed that she could stand up for herself and would not let herself be mistreated. But the longer she lived with this man, the more he dominated her, suppressing her will, feelings, and determination to stand up to him. John established his own rules in their home, and he treated his wife as nothing more than an object, constantly criticizing her, physically abusing her, and coercing intimacy, even when she was unwilling. Failed motherhood. The young wife naively believed that if they had a child together, her husband would soften and stop his cruel behavior. However, as it turned out, John had no desire to have children. Therefore, when Lorena informed him of her pregnancy in 1992, he became incredibly angry. He demanded that she get an abortion immediately, and they never revisited the subject. Lorena procrastinated for several weeks, hoping her husband would change his mind, but he remained adamant and continued to pressure her to comply. Eventually, he literally forced her to go to the hospital and terminate the pregnancy, which was a tremendous shock to her, and took a long time to recover from. In reality, John simply wanted to live for pleasure, unburdened by anything. He did not have a steady job, making ends meet by working as a bouncer in entertainment venues, and if he needed money, he would unashamedly take it from his wife, who worked as a manicurist and highly sought-after makeup artist in a beauty salon. The last straw. Lorena tried not to tell anyone about what was happening at home and not to complain, but her friends and colleagues began to notice changes in her behavior. From a joyful, smiling girl, she turned into a quiet, haunted shadow of her former self. Those around her suspected that all was not well in her family, but they had no idea how serious it was. Her husband's behavior became increasingly controlling. He closely monitored where she went and who she spoke to. At home, she had to follow the rules he set, and intimacy between them occurred only when John wanted it, regardless of Lorena's wishes. The poor girl couldn't share her problems with anyone, as she found the situation shameful and humiliating. On June 22, 1993, John, along with his longtime military buddy, decided to go out to an entertainment venue. The men partied and drank until late at night, while Lorena was at home alone. She did not wait up for her husband and went to the bedroom around midnight, soon falling asleep. Around 3 a.m, a drunk and aroused John returned home. He didn't waste any time and ripped the shirt off his sleeping wife. Lorena hardly understood what was happening when her husband forcefully took advantage of her. She begged him to stop and not to do this, crying, but he was completely indifferent to her pleas and tears. After it was over, John simply collapsed next to her and fell asleep. Lorena, trembling and sobbing, made her way to the kitchen. She poured herself some water and took a few sips to calm down, but then her gaze fell on a stand with large, sharp kitchen knives. Her hand reached out on its own and pulled out a carving knife. Out of her mind, she went back to the bedroom where her husband lay on his back, snoring drunkenly. She grabbed his genitalia with her left hand, squeezed hard, and sharply cut through with the knife, severing a large part of it. John jumped up, screaming in agony, while Lorena simply walked out of the room, went to the garage, and got into her car, speeding away through the deserted nighttime streets of the city. She only came to her senses at an intersection when she saw a red light at the traffic signal. At that moment, she looked at her blood-stained hands and realized that she was still holding the severed part of John's body in her left hand. She rolled down the window and threw the detested piece of flesh out, then continued driving. Lorena headed to the home of a close friend, who was stunned by her nighttime visit and the state she was in. After Lorena told her what had happened, her friend, realizing the gravity of the situation, called the police herself and summoned a medical team to the house where the injured Bobbitt was. Precision surgery. Throughout this ordeal, John was desperately trying to stop the bleeding by pressing a sheet against his wound. Notably, the groin vein is a major vessel, and its injury nearly always results in death from blood loss. However, John was somewhat fortunate, if one could say that, because a clot had formed, slowing the blood loss significantly. The responding medics arrived in time to transport him to the nearest hospital, where he received immediate medical attention. The question then arose about the whereabouts of the severed part of his genitalia, as it was still possible to reattach it, reattaching it to its original place with restoration of its initial physiological functions. Lorena indicated the approximate area of the road where she had discarded her husband's anatomical fragment, and after an extensive search, the police were able to find it. The amputated organ was cleansed with antiseptic, then placed in a special container with medical ice, and urgently transported to the hospital where the injured party was already being treated. The surgeon who arrived from the state capital was astounded by the complexity of the situation, as he had never encountered such a case before, but he proceeded with the operation anyway. He performed a unique surgery for that time, which lasted more than 9 hours and was more than successful. Despite the traumatic amputation of the organ and the fact that it had lain on the road for over an hour, all tissues and vessels were successfully reattached, and the patient quickly began to recover. Public outcry. That same night, Lorena was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning, as well as to clarify all the circumstances and motives of her actions. She immediately confessed to everything and shared her harrowing story that had driven her to such a desperate act. She recounted how 4 years of marriage had turned into a real nightmare for her, with her husband regularly abusing her both emotionally and physically, and forcing intimacy only when he desired. Mrs. Bobbitt also mentioned how, about a year ago, her husband had forced her to terminate a pregnancy, despite her deep desire to have a child, and that abortion had been a traumatizing event for her. Regarding the incident itself, she said she remembered very little of that night and had acted as if she were in a fog. Lorena recounted how her husband had come home drunk and simply taken advantage of her, and although she tried to resist, he ignored her. After the incident, she went to the kitchen for water, and the next thing she remembered was her husband's scream, the roar of the car engine, and the part of his genitalia that she was clutching in her hand as she sat behind the wheel. The case caused a significant stir in the press and was actively covered by the media. Many women, like Lorena, who had suffered from domestic violence, as well as feminist organizations, which were gaining strength and popularity at the time, rallied to her side. In the early 90s, wives who were subjected to emotional and physical abuse by their husbands typically remained silent about their plight. Society was still inclined to blame the victims themselves, suggesting that they provoked conflicts or behaved improperly. It was assumed that a wife should be submissive and obey her husband in everything, and if the husband was dissatisfied and resorted to violence, it was her fault. Intimacy in marriage was considered a duty of the wife, not open to discussion. On the other hand, almost all men sided with John. Many feared that Lorena's act might prove contagious, prompting other women suffering from physical and intimate violence in marriage to also take up knives. According to official statistics, there were several million such women in the country at that time. Trials and sentences of the spouses. 2 parallel court cases began almost simultaneously. Lorena officially charged her husband only with taking advantage of her on that fateful night, although in court she detailed the years of regular abuse and beatings, emotional violence, and humiliations she endured, as well as the abortion she was forced to undergo against her will, under her husband's coercion. John's testimony was confused. He denied all allegations against him, but much of what Lorena said was corroborated by facts. For instance, it was confirmed that he did not have steady employment or a stable source of income, yet he loved spending time in entertainment venues, often forcibly or deceitfully taking money from his wife to do so. Additionally, Lorena's friends confirmed that they had repeatedly seen bruises and scrapes on her body, and she had been in a depressed state for a long time, though she tried not to complain. The court concluded that the husband had indeed abused his wife both emotionally and physically throughout their marriage, driving her to desperation. However, regarding the charge of intimate violence that occurred on the night of June 23, 1993, there was not enough evidence, and thus, John was acquitted. He presented several versions of what happened that evening, and the jury, composed of 9 women and 3 men, found him not guilty in the fall of that year. Lorena's trial began in September 1993. She was charged with inflicting severe bodily harm on her spouse. Her lawyers argued that she acted while suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, caused by the ongoing emotional and physical abuse from her husband. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered, which confirmed that she acted in a state of distress, unaware of her actions, and therefore could not be held responsible for what she had done. In early January of the following year, after nearly 8 hours of deliberation, the jury decided that Lorena could not be held criminally responsible for her actions, as she was in a state of insanity at the time of the offense. However, she was required to undergo a 6-week treatment program at a specialized clinic, after which she was able to return to her previous life. The spouses officially divorced only in 1995, after which Lorena reverted to her maiden name. What became of John later? John remained indignant for a long time that his wife faced no punishment for her actions. He decided to fully capitalize on his sudden notoriety, aiming to extract as much money as possible from such scandalous fame. John founded his own music band called Severed Parts, but the group was short-lived as it failed to garner any public interest. When offered a substantial fee to star in adult films in the late 90s, he did not hesitate to accept. Thus, he appeared in explicit films titled Frankenpenis, a play on Frankenstein, and John Wayne Bobbitt, Uncut. John acted in several more films of a similar genre, but interest in him and his reattached organ quickly waned. For a long time, John was eager to appear on various talk shows and gave interviews extensively, but over the years, such offers became less frequent, and the story gradually faded from memory. John then found work as a bartender in an entertainment venue in Las Vegas, and by his 50s, he was struggling to make ends meet by taking jobs as a mover, driver, and pizza delivery man. In 1999, he received a suspended sentence for theft. Regarding his personal life, during the high-profile court case that the entire country followed, journalists discovered that Bobbitt had an illegitimate son named Andrew, born in 1992 to one of his lovers, Beatrice Williams. In 1994, John was brought to trial for assaulting his new girlfriend, Christina Elliott, who worked as a dancer in a nightclub. He spent 15 days in jail for this and received probation. In the early 2000s, John was arrested 3 times for assaulting his then-wife, Joanna Farrell. This time, he was imprisoned for a year for violating his probation. They officially divorced in 2004. What happened to Lorena? Unlike her former husband, Lorena did not take pride in her scandalous notoriety and tried to stay out of the limelight. In 1996, she decided to return to her native Ecuador, where her mother, Elvia, was living at the time. However, just 6 months later, Lorena made the news again when her mother accused her of assault. The conflict was resolved without going to court, and the women continued to live together. A year later, Lorena returned to the USA, where she opened her own small beauty salon in Washington. In 2007, she founded a foundation called Lorena's Red Wagon, which focused on helping women who had suffered from domestic violence. Soon after, Lorena agreed to give an interview for the first time in a long time and appeared on CBS News' The Morning Show, where she discussed her life post-incident. She also appeared on the popular Oprah Winfrey talk show. In the mid-2000s, Lorena remarried. Her new husband was a man named Dave Bellinger, with whom she had a daughter in 2006. She preferred not to recall her marriage to Bobbitt at all, and claimed she did not follow his life after their divorce. A meeting, 15 years later. In 2009, nearly 15 years after their sensational legal battles had ended, the former spouses met face-to-face for the first time on the show, Insider. John apologized to Lorena for the way he had treated her during their marriage and declared that he still loved her despite everything. Lorena was visibly moved by his words and confirmed that every year on Valentine's Day, her ex-husband still sends her flowers and cards. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to my channel. There are many shocking stories ahead of you.